Yirmiyahu was a prophet, was a good chaver of mine. Never understood a single word he said, but we helped him to drink his yain. And we always have some mighty fine yain. Singing Simchat Le'olam, Kol HaYeladim now. Simcha to the dogim in the deep blue sea. Simcha to you and me.
Welcome to the Haftarah Plethora video podcast, where we try our best to bring a little joy to the world by talking about prophets like Jeremiah. And guess what, Rick?
You're talking about Jeremiah?
You got it. As I've explained in the past, Jeremiah is only the fourth most frequently read prophet if you just count the Haftarah assignments by Shabbat and special occasions. But today, I'm going to explain why this particular Haftarah is especially rarely read.
Uh-oh, another one of your dissertations. I hope we have time to talk about the trope and chant the Haftarah at some point.
I promise that we'll get to both trope and the chanting and have a chance to talk about this rather negative narrative as well. But first, I'm Larry Herman, sipping some very good wine, port once again, talking Haftarah with my good chaver, the king of cannellation, Rick Muller. How are you doing, Rick?
Still recovering from Purim, and now we've got to get started preparing for Passover.
True. Many people have the tradition of starting their Pesach cleaning right after Purim. And it's also the time of year when we read lots of special Haftarot. Interestingly, the Haftarah for Parshat Tzav that we're discussing today is the last regularly scheduled Haftarah that we read for the next 7 Shabbatot, if you can believe that. And despite that fact, it turns out that the Haftarah for Tzav is one of the least frequently read Haftarot.
Well, I know we have 5 special Haftarot that we read this time of year, Shekalim and Zachor, both of which we've already read, and then Parah, HaChodesh, Shabbat HaGadol, all of which are coming up.
And Passover falls on a Shabbat twice this year, on the 1st and 8th days, and so we'll read a special Haftarah on those days, and then throw in a special Haftarah for Machar Chodesh, for Shabbat Achrei Mot, and boom, we won't be reading a regular Haftarah again until Parshat Kedoshim, 7 weeks from now.
Okay, but I thought you said that the Haftarah for Tzav was the rare one.
It is, Rick. In non-leap years, this Haftarah is not read because it always coincides with Shabbat HaGadol. But in leap years, it's more often either the Shabbat of Parshat Zachor, the Shabbat of Parshat Parah, or in Jerusalem, the Shabbat of Shushan Purim, when they repeat Zachor. It's only read in just a few Jewish leap years when the following Passover starts on a Sabbath or on Sunday.
Are you sure it doesn't have anything to do with the groundhog seeing his shadow?
No, Rick, that would be too unpredictable. And the cycle of Haftarah readings may be complex, but it's very predictable. You see, the Jewish calendar follows a 19-year cycle with 7 leap years and 14 distinct configurations of years called Geviot, depending on which days of the week Rosh Hashanah and Passover start. There are a few Haftarot that are read every single year, but most have several exceptions and a few are rarely read.
Like the Haftarah for Tzav.
Exactly.
So I think we should take advantage of this rare opportunity and talk about this very uncommon Haftarah.
Agreed. So let's start with the fact that this Haftarah actually covers 3 chapters of Jeremiah.
That's a lot of reading.
Except not everyone reads from all 3 chapters.
No, more complications?
Since we don't follow Chabad, the Yemenite tradition, the Italian tradition, or the tradition of Fez, Morocco, we'll read the last 14 verses of chapter 7, the first 3 verses of chapter 8, and then verses 22 and 23 from chapter 9.
Okay, that makes sense, I guess. I'm not even going to ask.
Well, you may not ask, but I'm going to explain anyway. As you know, the Torah portion for Tzav is all about the sacrifices, explained in fantastic detail, starting with the Olah, or the burnt offering, and continuing with the Zevach, or the sacrificial offering. And the opening verse of our Haftarah from Jeremiah indeed mentions both of these offerings.
Okay, and so?
Well, Rick, as I've explained several times, That's all our sages needed to connect a reading from the prophets to the parsha. But I think, in fact, I'll even say I'm quite sure that our sages had a very good reason for making the selection from chapter 7 of Jeremiah and for concluding by jumping to those 2 verses in chapter 9.
And what about the 3 verses of chapter 8?
Those 2, although I think they're a bit extraneous. Here's my brief explanation. The Torah portion includes all the mystifying detail regarding the commanded sacrifices. But by the time of the sages, more than a millennium later, there was no longer a temple where the sacrificial commandments could be carried out. So the sages drew upon the words of the prophets, who repeatedly emphasize that God wants us to act ethically, to do acts of chesed, mishpat, tzedakah, kindness, justice, and righteousness. Jeremiah provides the sages with a clear repudiation of the sacrifices as a cultic act to be followed strictly. In the opening verses of our Haftarah, he is perhaps mocking the people for their meaningless and imperfect observance of sacrifices. In fact, in my reading of the text, it's almost as if Jeremiah accuses the people of enjoying a temple barbecue when he says, "V'ichlu vasar," telling them to eat the meat in the first verse.
There's a long tradition of prophets of old, and even in our day, pointing out that many people obsess with ritual and don't focus on ethics at all.
Exactly. And that's exactly Jeremiah's message in chapter 7. He accuses the people and their ancestors of missing the point, of defiling God's name, of practicing idolatry, and even of horrors, child sacrifice.
Yeah.
As a consequence, Jeremiah prophesies the downfall of the towns of Judah and the ruin of the entire land.
Pretty dismal. I guess that's where the term Jeremiah comes from.
Indeed. Much of Jeremiah's prophesying is full of long, mournful complaints or lamentations, warning of moral decay, to apply the dictionary definition. But Jeremiah is also occasionally gives us hope. And that's why we jump to the first 2 verses of chapter 9.
Right. The sages had their tricks. They wanted to give the audience hope and an uplifting ending. How about if we talk about trope now?
Exactly my thinking, especially since you didn't put me on the spot to ask me about those 3 verses of chapter 8.
I figured we'd get back to them.
I better come up with an answer fast. Anyway, let's divide the reading as follows. We'll start with chapter 7, verses 21 through 28, where Jeremiah criticizes the people for not following the true moral intent of God's commandments. In the last 6 verses of chapter 7, Jeremiah prophesies the individual and collective doom as a consequence of the people's apostasy. Then we'll chant the first 3 verses of chapter 8, and perhaps by then I'll have figured out why we read them. And we'll conclude with the inspiring message contained in verses 22 and 23 of chapter 9.
So let me start by saying that there's a tavir on Koamar, verse 21, where normally we would have other trope for that famous prophetic announcement. Usually a yativ, where I hear Abe Berman's voice, or Munach Lagarme and a Ravia. So I asked myself, why a tavir? And then I saw more tavirs coming. They just keep echoing.
Rick, the second verse of the Haftarah starts with the word ki, one of 9 times that the word appears in our Haftarah, and the first of 4 times that it starts a verse, this time with the Talisha Gedolah. What's going on here?
Well, the word ki is very common. We know that. It's a connecting word. It can be an adverb, a conjunction, or a preposition. It can mean for, but, because, that, although, since, and many other words.
Wow.
Sometimes it's given a special trope, like here, the Talisha Gedolah, or even the more dramatic Yativ, which is coming up. It's usually telling us, pay attention, take note. In verse 23, that same little ki only gets a munach, followed by another munach on the next phrase, imet hadavar, before we get to the Talisha Gedolah on hazeh. Sometimes it's the phrase that's important and not just the word being emphasized. But in truth, there isn't much more trope-wise in this first section. So I'll just remind our audience that they can follow the text on the screen, which Norm prepares each week with careful attention.
Or they can follow along in the Eitz Chaim Chumash, starting on page 627. Rick, let's hear the bracha, La'asok b'divrei Torah.
Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam, asher kitshanu b'mitzvotav, v'tzivanu la'asok b'divrei Torah.
Amen.
Ko amar Adonai tzvaot Elohei Yisrael, olotechem sfu al zivchechem v'ichlu vasar, ki lo dibarti et avotechem velo tzivitim beyom otzi otam me'eretz Mitzrayim al divrei ola vazavach, ki im et hadavar hazeh tziviti otam lemor shimu v'koli ve'ayiti lachem le'elohim ve'atem tiyu li le'am v'halachtem b'chol haderech asher atzaveh etchem lema'an yitav lachem velo shamu velo hitu et oznam vayelchu b'mo etzot bishrirut libam hara vayiyu le'achor velo lefanim lemin hayom asher yatzu avotechem me'eretz Mitzrayim ad hayom hazeh vayeshlach alechem ekol avadai hanvim yom hashkem v'shaloach velo shamu elai velo hitu et oznam vayakshu et orpam heireu me'avotam v'dibarta alehem ekol hadvarim ha'ele velo yishmu elecha v'karata alehem velo ya'anucha ve'amarta alehem ze hagoy asher lo sham'u b'kol Adonai Elohav velo lachu musar avda ha'emunah v'nichreta mipihem.
Rick, do we have some tastier tamim in the next part?
Yeah, I see what you did there. A bit of a pun, huh? Tamim is the Hebrew word for trope. It also means tastes. But to answer your question, yes. So verse 29, there's a little drama in the poetry there that the Eitz Chaim sets apart. I like the way they do that. You have the yativ on ki in the middle of the line there. Just like you noted before, it's a dramatic pronouncement there, introducing the idea that God has rejected and abandoned those who provoked his fury. It's sufficient to call our attention to the important words that follow. And then verse 30, here come the Tavirs, V'nei Yehuda hara. The people of Judah have done evil. Evil. Say it ain't so, but it is. And then Shikutsehem babayit. They have placed abominations in my house. In my house, no. And then the worst Tavir of all, in verse 31, Lisrof. They burned their sons and daughters in the fire which God never commanded. Verse 32, we have a lachain, also a common prophetic pronouncement with a gershayim. It goes up twice, gershayim, lachain. So it's supposed to wake us up a little bit there. And then verse 33, your favorite Kadma V'Azla, on that one word, V'Hayita, as if to emphasize with its compactness, yes, this will come to pass.
None of this is pleasant to hear.
No.
But it gets even worse in the last verse of the chapter, verse 34. We start with a Munach Lagarme on V'Hishbati Me'arei Yehuda. JPS translates this as, and I will silence in the towns of Judah. But Alter's translation is even more ominous, and I will put an end in the towns of Judah. The end of the verse requires no dramatic trope, since the words are powerful enough by themselves, starting with our word of the day, yet another ki. Ki lacharba tiyeh haaretz. For a ruin the land shall become. As Alter explains, with a grim note of desolation, the destruction of the entire land will be turned into a desolation. On this depressing note, Rick, chant the end of chapter 7, please.
Wait, let me throw in verse 34, you do have Kol Sasson and Kol Simcha and Kol Chatan and Kol Kala. So that's an echo of that happy verse from another part of the Tanakh. So here Jeremiah is using that as a counterpoint. But there is a little bit of a gleam of happiness there if we can get to that.
Well,
anyway,
if we can get to it.
Yeah.
Because basically he's saying he'll silence those voices of happiness.
Yeah.
You really got to take it out of context in order to make it a happy thing.
Yes, I just did. Verse 29. Gozi nizrech v'hashlichi usi al shfayim kina ki ma'as Adonai vayitosh edor evrato ki asu b'nei Yehuda hara be'enai neum Adonai samu shikutsehem babayis asher nikra shemi alav litamo uvanu bamot hatofet asher begay venchinom lisrof et benehem vet benotehem ba'esh asher lo tziviti velo alta alibi lachen ine yamim ba'im neum Adonai velo yeamer od hatofet v'geven hinom ki imge haharega v'kavru v'tofet me'en makom v'hayeta nivlat ha'am hazeh l'ma'achal le'of hashamayim ulvehamat ha'aretz ve'en macharid v'hishbati me'arei Yehuda u'mechutzot Yerushalayim Kol Sasson V'kol Simcha Kol Chatan V'kol Kala Ki lechorba tiyeh haaretz.
Rick, I just looked it up while you were chanting.
Yes.
And it turns out that phrase that you mentioned, Kol Simcha,
Kol Sasson.
right? The Kol Sasson. That phrase is used 4 times by Jeremiah.
Oh wow!
So I didn't have time to look at to see them. One of them was in chapter 33, but they must be happier times.
Yeah, I would hope so. Okay, so tell us what's going on in the first 3 verses of chapter 8.
Well, I was stalling, Rick. I can only tell you, though, that things get worse. The prophecy here is almost too horrible to imagine. Somewhat reminiscent of the Book of Lamentations, which is also attributable to Jeremiah. The bones of everyone, from king to commoner, will be disinterred, spread out to be bleached by the sun and moon, which ironically the people heretically worshipped, and this physical remnant of the people shall be like manure, and death shall be preferable to life for any who actually survive. Ultimate humiliation. Why the sages wanted to take us even lower by extending the reading to these 3 verses, I have not a clue.
No, me neither. But the first 2 verses are filled with special trope, fireworks. The first verse, 8:1, has the only pause there on Ne'um Adonai, after 2 munachs leading into it and 3 following. So this is going to be some special thing here, but it's pretty horrible. All the disinterred bones get special music. First, a Talisha Ketana, Kadma V'Azla combo on Vetatzmot Sarav, Vetatzmot HaKohanim. Then a Munach Lagarme, Ravia combo on the bones of the prophets. And finally, another Tavir leading to the bones of the common residents of Jerusalem. And the fancy fireworks continue in describing the idolatrous relationships. Ushtachum lashemesh v'le'areach. There's your sun and the moon, v'lachot tzavah shamayim, and the hosts of heaven. It's pretty bad stuff. And finally, the last bad tavir on the word lidomen, like dung. What a downer. Let me get this over.
Go ahead and chant. Pretty depressing stuff.
Yeah. Ba'et hahi Ne'um Adonai Yotziu et atzmot Malchei Yehuda Ve'et atzmot Sarav Ve'et atzmot HaKohanim Ve'et atzmot Hanviim Ve'et atzmot Yoshvei Yerushalayim Mikivrehem Ushchatu Ushtachum Lashemesh V'layareach Ulechol Tzva Shamayim Asher Ahevum V'asher Avadum V'asher Halachu Achrehem V'asher Drashum V'asher Hishtachavu Lahem Lo Yeasfu V'lo Yikaveru Ledomen Al Pnei Hadama Yiyu V'nivchar Mavet Mechayim Lechol Asherit Anisharim Min HaMishpacha Hara'a Hazot V'chol HaMekomot Anisharim Asher Hidachtim Sham Ne'um Adonai Tzvaot.
Rick, it's enough to drive you to drink. It's that bad. But we've got to end on a happier, or at least more hopeful note.
Please. I totally agree. In the 2 extra verses from chapter 9, then, we're given the solution to the problem, even if it might seem a little bit off mark. We start with another Ko Amar Adonai. Save us, give us some better news.
Okay, but it's basically a call for humility. Let not the wise man boast of his wisdom, nor the warrior boast of his might. Let not the rich man boast of his riches.
So who gets to boast? Jeremiah tells us in verse 23. Ki'im bezot, with a ger shayim there, starting with another one of our keys. And just do this. This zot is the important word there. Then Yitalel Hamitalel with a Revia Haskel, V'yadoa Oti with a Zarka and a Sigol, very rare trope as well. The boaster who gets to boast is the guy who understands and knows God. Why? Because yet another key, this time with a Yativ, because Ani Adonai, Jeremiah says, God is God. Osech said, the best Tavir, Mishpat Utzdaka Ba'aretz. God is doing kindness and justice and righteousness in the land. And then the final key, Ki ve'ele chafatzti num Adonai, for in these I delight, declares Adonai.
Rick, I think we found the key to the Haftarah.
Yeah, very funny.
Take us home.
Ko amar Adonai, al yitalel chacham b'chokhmato, ve'al yitalel hagibor bigvurato, al yitalel ashir be'oshro, ki im bezot yitalel hamitalel haskel biadoa oti, ki ani Adonai osech chesed mishpat utzdaka ba'aretz, ki ve'ele chafatzti neum Adonai.
Ending happily. That's great for once.
Yes.
As always, thanks to Norm Gar for all the beautiful graphics, the text, and the editing that he does every week. And don't forget to write us with your thoughts and comments. Our emails are below. And if you like our Zoomcast, please forward the link to your friends and your family. As we mentioned, this is the last regular Haftarah for a while. We'll be reprising episodes for Shabbat Para, Shabbat HaChodesh, and Shabbat HaGadol over the next 3 weeks. But we'll be back with original episodes for the special Passover Haftorot in time for Pesach.
Have fun getting ready for that.
Shabbat Shalom.
Shabbos.